Hello, everyone. Welcome to our event, the Election Reform Agenda, a deep dive into H.R.1, where we will discuss the most pressing issues on election administration that are shaping our democracy. My name's Carla Eckhart, and I'm the Executive Director of the Stanford Center on Philanthropy and Civil Society, where we support scholars in producing quality research that informs policy, social innovation, nonprofit, and philanthropic practices. Over the course of this series, we will be joined by a rich mix of experts on the topics in discussion. Today's panel on voting rights will be led by Nate Persley, the co-director of the Program on Democracy and the Internet at Stanford PACS and the Stanford MIT Healthy Elections Project. I'll turn it over now to our partners for this event, the Center on Democracy, Development, and the Rule of Law, and the Associate Director for Research, Dee Dee Kuo. Thanks for being here.
Thanks so much, Carla, and thank you everyone for joining us today. We have an amazing session lined up on voting rights provisions of H.R.1, the For the People Act. Next Monday's session focuses on gerrymandering, and Tuesday we'll close it out with campaign finance. Today, in order of speaking, we have a panel beginning with Mirna Perez, who's Director of the Voting Rights and Elections Program at the Brennan Center for Justice, followed by Janae Nelson, Associate Director Counsel of the NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund, Dale Ho, Director of the Voting Rights Project at the American Civil Liberties Union, ACLU, and finally, Guy Charles, Edward and Ellen Schwartzman Professor of Law at Duke Law School. We'll then turn to questions from Nate Persley and also from you, the audience. So please use the Q&A box to enter your questions anytime, and follow the event on Twitter using the hashtag #electionreforms. Thank you. Now over to you, Mirna.
Thank you. I am just trying to share my screen. Can you guys see that?
Not yet.
Not yet. Okay, then maybe I will skip it because it's not working as well as I'd hoped. I am here to talk about the voting rights provisions of H.R.1, but one of the things that I think is really important to note is that H.R.1 incorporates specifically the provisions of the Voting Rights Act. It says in it, that it's going to make a commitment to restore the Voting Rights Act. And so because these are two critically important pieces of federal legislation, I am going to make sure that we understand both of them. So H.R.1 is a comprehensive bill. It takes on a great number of reforms. It includes things like online registration and same-day registration and voting by mail. It has a number of different provisions, and all of these provisions can be thought of in two kinds of buckets: a bucket that deals with an across-the-board approach, or a bucket that is responsive to a particular community request. So the across-the-board approaches are very helpful in making sure that voters have a baseline minimum of the kind of customer service that they get from election administrators. It makes sure that there is a federal floor and that no matter where they live, they're going to get some kind of access to the system that is going to look at least similar to what their neighbors are. Of course, neighbors in another state can decide to do better than that.
Mirna, let me just interrupt you a second. I do have your slides. Would it be useful to you if I actually...
Yeah, maybe that might be helpful, please. I'm sorry, I'm not sure what the problem is, but yeah, if you don't mind doing that, that would be great, because I do want them to see some stuff. Okay, so now we're on the next slide. Great. So as I mentioned, these are the kinds of things that I'm putting in the across-the-board reform. But it's important to remember that notwithstanding the fact that it's across the board, this is still going to be really helpful to our communities of color, because those are the ones that have the most to catch up with in terms of access. When something goes wrong, these are the voters that are going to have the fewest margins to overcome the barriers. And these are the voters who have suffered the historical discrimination that is putting them in a different position vis-a-vis other voters. So these across-the-board reforms are going to make it so that there are fewer barriers for everyone and provide more options for voters and provide risk diversification in case something goes wrong. Can you go to the next slide, please, Nate? Now, the specific reforms are reforms that that Janae and Dale and I and others have been having to deal with that are coming from the bottom up. Like, are the communities that we represent are telling us these are particular problems that they're facing and that they need more support at a federal level for these reforms because the states are not doing their jobs. In some instances, we can see individual actors threaten voting rights. So, for example, the kind of intimidation and deceptive practices that we saw happen in the last election, where people at all levels of government and random people on the street were spreading misinformation and disinformation and intimidating voters. But it also provides specific provisions that deal with when the state is deciding to try and suppress their votes. And I know that my colleague Janae is going to talk about restoring voting rights to people with criminal convictions, but I think that's an important one to lift up here because when you have an incident like in Florida, in which the people passed a historic constitutional amendment to end the policy of permanent disenfranchisement, only to have the state legislature come in and try and undermine that victory, we know that the federal government needs to step in. We know that these voters don't have the same kind of bargaining power or are able to use the ballot box in a way that they're going to get a fair result that leads them into a robust, that leads us into a robust elections. Can you advance the slide, please? But what H.R.1 does not do, it does not solve the pathology of racial discrimination in voting. It does not make good on the promise that we have made in the 14th and 15th Amendment that when you step into the ballot box, you are going to be free from racial discrimination in voting. And to H.R.1's credit, it recognizes that and puts in a particular title lots of language about the importance of restoring the Voting Rights Act, recognizing that the Voting Rights Act was severely weakened as a result of a Supreme Court decision in 2013 called Shelby County versus Holder. And so part of the H.R.1 advocacy is making sure that Congress makes good on the commitment that it is making in H.R.1 that it is going to restore the Voting Rights Act. Can you please advance the slide? So the Voting Rights Advancement Act is a piece of legislation that passed the House. It's been renamed the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act in the Senate. I'm going to be talking about the specific provisions in the House version that passed. And what it tries to do are two things. One, it tries to account for the fact that racial discrimination is alive and well in this country. We saw numerous instances of it in 2020. And the fact that we have fewer federal protections than in the past. And so there are a number of provisions of it. These are the ones that I want to lift up, given the time that we have, but we could take up an entire seminar talking about the VRAA. Next slide, please. The section that gets a lot of attention is what sometimes is called the preclearance provisions. Preclearance is just a fancy name for the idea that before an election change is supposed to happen, we need to get certification in advance that the change is not going to make minority voters worse off or did not have the intent of making the minority voters worse off. Now, the VRAA has two different kinds of preclearance. It has one that gets triggered by geography, and it gets one that gets triggered by the kind of electoral change you're trying to make. And in both instances, it relies on documented evidence of discrimination to say that either a particular jurisdiction or state or a particular practice needs to be subject to the preclearance process because there's enough of a there to suggest that voters need to take, that politicians need to take a pause and make sure that what they're about to do isn't going to make minority voters worse off. If you could advance the slide. But that's not all. Voters also are going to get more transparency and additional notice in the VRAA. There are two kinds of notice that is just, contemplated in the VRAA. One is more general. It has to do with any sort of election change that happens within 180 days of an election and sets forth the rules and the practices for how voters are supposed to get notice. The other is specific to particular kinds of changes, namely whether or not there's a change to electoral districts or whether or not there's a change to polling places or the kinds of machines that they get there. These are going to be critically, I think, relevant and salient to people given how many changes we saw in the 2020 election, and voters were the last to find out about it. So these kinds of notice provisions are going to be doing the work that Janae and Dale and I and the other people in the field can't do, of being everywhere at every time to be able to protect our voters. These notice provisions will allow voters to be their own advocate. Next slide, please. But again, given the limited resources of the public interest and civil rights organizations out there to protect voters, the VRAA also sets forth ways in which the Attorney General can send out federal observers. These will be people who are on the ground, monitoring what is happening, deterring against intimidation, and being able to report out what they see on the ground. And the Attorney General will be able to deploy these observers if it is necessary to enforce either the 14th or 15th Amendment or the language access provisions of the Voting Rights Act. Next slide. And finally, the VRAA recognizes that jurisdictions who have the data, who have the inertia, who have the power of the state are at a great advantage vis-a-vis voters in issues of litigation. And it also recognizes that if a vote or a voice is silenced in an election, it's lost. You can have another election in which maybe that person will be able to vote against, but that is a moment in time. That is a reflection of interest and a voice that will be silenced forever. And as such, it encourages courts to look at particular criteria that will both allow for a sensible balancing of the harms when courts are having to decide to provide emergency and injunctive relief. And it will not allow states to use their own interest in discriminating as a cause or a justification to tip the scales in the favor of allowing the discriminatory policy to maintain. So in sum, H.R.1 makes a commitment to the Voting Rights Act, but we need both of them. We need both the VRAA and we need H.R.1. And my hope is that we will be talking about these two in tandem, because we're both solving the problems of election administration in one, and we're dealing with the problem of racial discrimination in the other, which have different constitutional roots, different kinds of history, serve different kinds of community, but are both critically important.
All right, thank you so much for that, Mirna. Next, we have Janae Nelson. I can turn on.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Am I visible yet or no?
Not yet.
All right, let me turn on my video. Okay,
Excellent.
great. Thanks so much for that introduction, Mirna. It's great to have that overview to kick off the conversation. And as you point out, we need both H.R.1 and H.R.4 to protect voting rights and to make our democracy that much less vulnerable to many of the attacks that we saw in this past election. And you raised, Congressman John Lewis, the late Congressman John Lewis, and it's beautiful to see that H.R.4 has now been renamed in his honor, but he was also instrumental in advancing H.R.1. And in fact, he said that the vote is the most powerful, nonviolent instrument of transformation we have in our democracy. And at the foundation of our system, it must be strengthened and preserved. And that's why we have introduced H.R.1. And when we consider the events of late and the escalation of political violence in this country, protecting the right to vote is as much a matter of national security as it is a civil rights issue. So it is wonderful that Stanford is taking such an interest in really parsing through the provisions of H.R.1, because they are so critically important to the protection of our democracy on a number of levels. As Mirna already alluded to, the For the People Act, H.R.1, does a masterful job of tackling a wide range of structural weaknesses and vulnerabilities in our election system at a number of levels. There are some gaps, and I hope to address at least some of them with respect to certain areas. And I look forward to also talking about the potential challenges that we might face, not just politically, but also legally, in defending some of these provisions. But I think we must start from the clear premise that Congress has authority under the 14th and 15th Amendments to pass legislation, enforcement legislation, to protect the right to vote, to protect it on an equal basis for all citizens, and also to protect it from racial discrimination. And H.R.1, as I said, does an excellent job of advancing that by creating new voters through automatic voter registration and same-day registration, and removing eligibility barriers for returning citizens through the Rights Restoration Clause. It also expands the ways in which voters can have their voices heard by providing multiple pathways to the ballot box, including early and mail-in voting. It also protects voters from schemes and devices known to disenfranchise voters, like voter caging and improper voter challenges and voter intimidation and discriminatory list maintenance, all of which we saw on full display leading up to the last general election and then the Georgia runoff subsequently. Each and every one of these changes is sorely needed to protect our nonviolent instrument of transformation, as John Lewis called it. But I want to focus on three areas of protection in particular, in part because of the critical role that they played in recent general elections, but also because of what I predict will become their essentiality to access in our democracy. Those two are mail-in voting and early voting, and I know that some of this was discussed yesterday, so I'll try to truncate my remarks. And I first want to lift up what H.R.1 does to remove what is one of the final vestiges of direct disenfranchisement of many of our citizens, and one that actually works to effect racial discrimination in voting, and that is the disenfranchisement of people based on a felony conviction. So subtitle E of H.R.1 prohibits anyone from being denied the right to vote in federal elections due to a felony conviction unless they are in a correctional facility. And I'll put an asterisk next to that and circle back to that limitation. It also requires states to provide notice to persons with felony convictions of their eligibility to vote, thereby instigating what we hope will be a voter registration process and a restoration of the right to vote. We know from research from the Sentencing Project that 5.2 million Americans are prohibited from voting because of felony disenfranchisement. That is 2.3% of the voting age population, or 1 out of 44 adults, which is a fairly staggering statistic. And nearly 4.7 million of those disenfranchised citizens have been released from prison and yet are still denied the right to vote. It's no secret that people of color are disproportionately represented in the prison population and therefore disproportionately represented in this disenfranchised population. 1 in 16 African Americans of voting age is disenfranchised. That's a rate of 3.7 times greater than non-African Americans. And over 6.2% of the adult African American population is disenfranchised compared to 1.7%. Why do I tell you these stats? In part because of the way in which felon disenfranchisement has been justified over time and some of its constitutional vulnerabilities. So felon disenfranchisement has been challenged on multiple levels by many of the people on this panel today. And most of those battles have not been successful because of a constitutional provision that provides a presumptive constitutionality for disfranchising people on the basis of a criminal conviction. And that's Section 2 of the 14th Amendment. It reads in relevant part that the right to vote cannot be denied. No state shall make or enforce a law that abridges the right to vote without due process of law or deny equal protection of the laws. But it carves out an exception if anyone has been involved in the commission of a crime. And it is that sort of throwaway language, if you will, that has provided the justification for states to disenfranchise on the basis of a criminal conviction. The original major challenge to felon disenfranchisement was in a case called Richardson versus Ramirez out of California in 1974. But about 11 years later, there was another case, Hunter versus Underwood, where the Supreme Court unanimously held that Section 2 did not protect disenfranchisement if it was for the purpose of discriminating on the basis of race. We know that many felon disenfranchisement laws have their origins in intentional racial discrimination. It is on that basis that I think H.R.1's rights restoration provision can survive constitutionality because of the disproportionate impact that it has on people of color, African Americans in particular, and especially if you consider the racist origins of many of those laws. Congress has the ability to correct that through the 15th Amendment and of course also through the 14th Amendment, and that is what I believe H.R.1 does in restoring voting rights to persons with criminal convictions. I noted at the outset that an asterisk that it does not apply to people who are currently in correctional facilities, which I think is a significant and unfortunate limitation of this provision. The Legal Defense Fund and many of the folks here whose organizations are represented on this panel have supported individuals being able to vote regardless of their incarceration status, because the right to vote should not be deprived for that reason. So this is a way in which I think H.R.1 does not go far enough, but in many ways, I do think that that will also help protect its constitutionality and make it hopefully more viable in terms of passage. I should also note that what this provision does is really follow a trend that has been occurring over the past 25 years or so, where states have changed their laws to provide greater voting access to returning citizens. In fact, Oregon is likely to soon join Maine and Vermont as one of 3 states that actually permits incarcerated persons to vote. And many states allow returning citizens to vote at various stages of their relationship with the criminal legal system. So H.R.1, I hope will accelerate some of the work that's being done at the state level and provide a foundation for it. Of course, it only applies to federal elections, so states will still be able to disfranchise if they choose to, but it makes it that much harder to try to run parallel election systems for state laws, for state elections and federal elections when you have H.R.1 requiring that states notify returning citizens and permit them an opportunity to vote. I'm not sure where I am on time, but I want to just quickly mention early voting and mail-in voting, and particularly because I think they are both significant game changers. First and foremost, obviously, early voting gives people more opportunities to vote at times that are convenient for them. It prevents work disruption on election day. But most importantly, it gives us a window into some of the obstacles that may present on election day. Many of us are part of an election protection network that started a couple of decades ago, and there's a hotline 1-866-OUR-VOTE through which we receive many complaints and reports about obstacles to voting. We received nearly 32,000 calls from voters across the country, many thousands of those coming in during the early voting period. And it's an early warning system of what some of the frailties might be on election day and allows us an opportunity to intervene where necessary to try to seek legal redress if possible when there are substantial obstacles to the right to vote. Mail-in voting similarly provides a greater avenue for people to cast ballots. And what H.R.1 does is create an infrastructure around mail-in voting, and I think it addresses, gets out ahead of some of the critiques about mail-in voting. We know they're lodged in a myth of voter fraud. Voter fraud has been used as a means to instigate many oppressive laws and a way to castigate mail-in voting. Mail-in voting, as compared to other forms of voting, has experienced a higher degree of fraud, but it's still infinitesimal if you consider the numbers. But thankfully, H.R.1 gets out ahead of that by requiring signature verification, even laying a foundation for potential biometric verification. and also allows for the curing of any signature deficiencies, which helps to bolster due process rights for voters who choose to cast a ballot this way. And I think is quite robust in balancing the concerns about mail-in voting with expanding access to it, and including the uniformity on when or how to count ballots and by when they can be cast. So for example, if they're postmarked on or before the date of an election, a state is required to accept and process those ballots. It doesn't answer some of the thorny questions that we saw last election about when states can begin to process mail-in ballots, which we know can lead to the delay in the ultimate count in various elections. There are, open questions about that. There are ways in which early voting and mail-in voting can still be manipulated, as is seen through the slowdown in the post office, which required litigation to solve. Also, we've seen, for example, the inequitable distribution of early voting sites and are litigating those cases as well. So H.R.1 doesn't solve those frailties, but I think it is a very strong step in the right direction and begins to address many of the quite alarming tactics that we saw in the general election and in the subsequent runoffs in Georgia, and really helps to structuralize something that I think will be an enduring feature of our election system going forward in light of the pandemic and many ways in which access to voting is challenged. So I will stop there, but look forward to chatting more about some of these during the Q&A.
Thank you so much, Janae. Now we have Dale Ho.
Hi, I'm Dale Ho. I'm the director of the ACLU's Voting Rights Project. I'm going to talk very briefly today about two of the voter registration reforms contained in H.R.1, automatic voter registration and election day registration. And I'm going to concentrate my remarks on election day registration. Automatic registration, I'll just say briefly, is a reform that is of a relatively recent vintage. The first state to adopt it was Oregon just a few years ago. And it is a reform that has generated a lot of enthusiasm. Basically, it requires the state itself to assume the burden of making sure that voters are registered and that their registration is up to date, rather than what most states have done throughout history, as long as we've had voter registration, which is to put the onus on citizens themselves. Automatic registration, like I said, has generated a lot of excitement and enthusiasm. The early returns suggest that it is quite effective in terms of boosting registration rates and concomitantly turnout. But I'm going to focus my remarks today on election day registration, which has been around a bit longer. The social science research concerning the effect of election day registration on voter registration rates and on turnout is a little bit longer standing and more robust. I like to think of election day registration as a reform that benefits voters universally in a way that automatic registration may not always. Automatic registration is limited in terms of its scope to individuals whom the state can already identify in existing governmental databases. That is, for example, DMV databases. That's kind of the most common way in which states that have adopted automatic registration have implemented it. They automatically register people who are in that state's DMV database, but are not yet registered to vote. And while that is great and it captures a lot of voters and ensures that a lot more people are registered who wouldn't otherwise be, not everyone has a driver's license or a state issued ID maintained by a state's Department of Motor Vehicles. Election day registration, by contrast, is something that's open essentially to everyone. It permits voters to register on election day itself, rather than requiring voters to register in advance of an election, say 20 days, in some states as much as 30 days before the election. It's a reform that has been used in some states since the 1970s. And the social science research on election day registration and its effect on turnout is rather strong. There isn't really any debate amongst social scientists who study turnout as to the effectiveness of election day registration in terms of boosting turnout. A number of political science studies indicate that the effects are particularly pronounced among historically low turnout or disenfranchised groups like young voters, low-income voters, and voters of color. And we have, like I said, decades of research supporting that conclusion. If you just look anecdotally at the 2020 election, and you just rank states by their turnout rates, the top 7 states in terms of turnout were all states that offer election day registration, and 8 of the top 10 states in terms of turnout offer election day registration. Overall, 21 states in the District of Columbia have election day registration. People can show up at the polls. Oh, excuse me. Sorry about that. People show up at the polls on election day and can register. So H.R.1 would extend that reform to the remaining 29 states. There's some very interesting research from the last decade that sort of suggests how powerful election day registration could be in terms of boosting voter participation. Looking at internet searches for voter registration. If you look at internet searches for voter registration, sort of the closer you get to election day, each day, the number of people who search Google for information about registration increases. And expected, voter interest in an election typically increases the closer you get to the election. There's greater media coverage the closer you get to an election. People remember to do, remember that they might need to update their registration, or if they've moved, register for the first time in their new location. Kind of the closer you get to election day. And if you look at the rates at which people register to vote, those numbers also increase the closer you get to election day. So you see this kind of twin increase in Google searches for information about voter registration and voter registration activity. Each day you get closer to the election. Now, what happens in states that cut registration off before election day, 10 or 20 or 30 days beforehand, when you get to that cutoff, voter registration plummets, because of course it becomes a futile act if you want to participate in that year's election to register. But the number of people who continue searching for information about voter registration continues to increase the closer you get to the election day. And that suggests that if you didn't have the cutoff, voter registration activity would continue and might even reach a peak on election day itself. I think the seminal study on Google research, on Google searches and voter registration by a professor of political science named Alex Street suggested that you might get as many as 5 million more voters in an average presidential election if you had election day registration. Now, why? We don't know exactly why, right? We've observed the increase in turnout in states where there is election day registration, but there are a few different hypotheses. One is just sort of as a simple logistical matter, election day registration simplifies the registration process from 2 steps to 1. Instead of having to sort of learn about registration and do it before a deadline and know what that deadline is, and then go vote on election day or in person during early voting or by absentee, it just makes the whole process a single step. Show up at the polls on election day if you choose to vote in person, register to vote, and then cast your ballot. It allows voters who may have moved and have not updated their registration to do that at the polls on election day. And it also provides a safety net for people to correct errors in their registration information. If a voter's been purged from the rolls erroneously, election day registration gives them an opportunity to reestablish registration and vote in that election. So in sum, there is much more social science certainty, I would say, about the turnout boosting effects of election day registration than there is about the depressive effects of the many forms of voter suppression that organizations like the ACLU and the NAACP Legal Defense Fund and the Brennan Center and others are frequently litigating against, whether that's voter ID laws, which you sometimes hear about, cutbacks on early voting, voter purges. These are all forms of voter suppression that many of those in the voting rights community like myself are often concerned about. The social science research about just how many people those suppressive measures actually prevent from voting is candidly a bit mixed. Some research suggests it's a lot, some suggests it's difficult to measure. But the number of people that election day registration and automatic registration could potentially enfranchise and bring into the process, I think there's broad consensus, dwarfs the effects of those different kinds of suppressive measures, at least in terms of the total number of voters affected. Now, there might be specific individuals who lack ID and can't get it or face significant burdens in doing it. I don't mean to suggest that election day registration and automatic registration are cure-alls for all kinds of voter suppression measures. But if we're concerned about just the number of people who participate in American elections, you'd be hard-pressed to find a single reform that would do more for that than election day registration. Thanks a lot.
Great. Thank you so much, Dale. Now, Guy Charles.
Good afternoon. So my comments actually follow very nicely from Dale's comments. In my view, H.R.1 is the most significant civil rights legislation, voting rights legislation that Congress has considered since the 64 Civil Rights Act and 65 Voting Rights Act. And I'll point out 4 of what I think are its important features. First, it recognizes that voting is a constitutional right. And this is a seismic shift in American law as well as in American culture. And so the bill explicitly states the right to vote is a fundamental right of citizens of the United States. The way that we think about voting in the US, particularly within our constitutional structure, you don't see, unlike advanced democracies, where voting is explicitly articulated as a constitutional right, we have a negative rights framework. So for example, the 15th Amendment provides that voting can be denied on the basis of race, or the 19th on the basis of gender. But to create a positive voting rights framework in which we say that voting is a fundamental right and that we're going to do everything that we can to assure that the voter can participate and can vote, that is a cultural shift as well as a political shift. And the significant battles that we're seeing in American democracy today is around this conception of whether voting is a fundamental right and what we should do to assure that people have the right to vote. We fight a war of attrition in American democratic politics. We raise the burdens to make it harder for people to vote as opposed to making it easier. So H.R.1 its first important move is the recognition that voting is a fundamental right. Its second important move is that it shifts the burden on accessibility from the individual and to the state. And I'll come back and talk about this in a moment. Third, it focuses on making the exercise of the right accessible to everybody. So it's one thing to think about voting as a fundamental right, but the administration of election, making that right accessible is critically important. And by making that right accessible, by limiting barriers or lowering barriers, you lower barriers for vulnerable communities, including communities of color. Third, it has a number of really critical and important features. So for example, it centralizes and standardizes aspects of election administration that are extremely important. It limits state discretion. My co-panelists mentioned voter caging, right? There are certain things that states do, particularly when states are using election laws as a way of holding on to power and gaining advantage. And so one of the things that this bill does, and if it's enacted, the statute would do, is that it limits the state's discretion. It takes some things off the table that we know are suppressive devices. It also expands the electorate. So it makes it easier for younger voters. It makes it easier for voters with disability. It makes it easier for voters who've had a previous felony conviction, right? So overall, it takes some of the best practices that we know that makes voting accessible, and it centralizes them and makes them uniform, and it standardizes them. So if there is anything in American law and practice, if we can do the things that H.R.1 does, it will completely transform American voting practices and shift the burden from individuals who have to bear the cost of voting. So for example, Dale just talked about same-day registration, right? By having same-day registration, you're shifting the burden of political participation from the individual who has to think about it 15, 20, 30, 40 days, whatever the outer limit is for registration, you're shifting that from the individual to the state. Automatic registration, another place where you're shifting those burdens. And what H.R.1 does, it takes the best practices, the things that we know work, that limits burdens of participation on vulnerable communities, and it standardizes them and it implements them for federal elections. The third thing that I want to focus on is the importance of making these practices uniform across federal elections, so that when I'm voting in an election for senator as a federal elector, my practices are not dependent upon my race, are not dependent upon my geography, are not dependent on my socioeconomic interests, right, income, right, SES, that it's a function of being a federal voter, that there are certain sets of rights that I get as a consequence of being a federal voter and participating in a federal election. And this shift is not only important, and Janae mentioned this earlier in her presentation, it is also possible that state practices will follow the federal example. So it's not just important that this is happening at the federal level. Few states are going to want to have different rules, different practices for state elections as opposed to federal elections. So they might simply follow the federal practice and therefore raise the baseline for everyone in both federal as well as state elections. And the other thing that the statute does is that it provides funds for the states to modernize their election practices. And by providing funds to modernizing election practices, that also makes it easier for states to run one unitary system that raises the floor at the federal level, at the level that is set by H.R.1. The last point then that I want to touch on is the constitutionality argument. So if Congress has any power, right, especially in a court that is in which the conservatives on the court maintain a significant supermajority, 6-3, if Congress has any power to change our electoral practices, it has that power in the context of federal elections. And so what we see here is a statute that then articulates a number of bases for its constitutionality: the Elections Clause, Article 1, Section 4, Clause 1, the Guarantee Clause, Clause, Article 4, Section 4, the 14th Amendment Fundamental Rights Framework, that voting is a fundamental right, as well as the prohibition against racial discrimination, gender discrimination, poll tax discrimination, etc. So there, Congress is using the panoply of its powers to enforce this statute or to promulgate the statute and then to enforce the statute. By contrast, for example, with the VRAA under this current court might not fare as well. So from my perspective, we have a policy here that I think is long overdue in American politics, that it shifts the burden, that it declares voting as a fundamental right, that it enacts the best sets of practices, centralizes them, standardizes them, so that if you're a federal voter voting in Nebraska, you have similar, it will never be exactly the same, but a similar set of experiences than if you're a voter voting in North Carolina or in South Carolina. And it moves us in the direction where, in my view, we ought to be going, which is the recognition that voting is a fundamental right, that Congress has the power to assure that access to the ballot is uniform, and that race or gender or geography or socioeconomic status should not be a burden, that we centralize best practices, that we figure out what works, how to expand the electorate. So if it's automatic registration, we do that. So if it's same-day registration, we do that. We centralize those best practices. We have a framework for doing so, so that all of us then can have a voice in this democracy. The way that we run American politics currently is that we simply say, as I said, it's a war of attrition. If you can show up, we're going to, sort of, at least in some places, make it harder for you. And then we depend upon the organizations that my co-panelists run, Miana's organization, Janae's, Dale's, to fight against suppressive efforts. This statute or this bill would completely change that framework. And this is one of the reasons why then, and I'll close here, I think it is the central and most important bill that can come before Congress, because it makes democracy accessible to all voters and changes the way that we've done business, and makes it so much harder for states to engage in suppression and voting discrimination. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Guy. Let me just stick with you as law professor to law professor here a little bit. Can you talk about the likely constitutional challenges to these provisions? Obviously, there's a lot there, and different provisions would have different challenges. You know, we're not even talking about like campaign finance provisions, which had First Amendment, but just on the authority of Congress to pass these provisions. What is your view about, obviously it's a conservative court. You mentioned the multiple clauses in the Constitution which potentially give power to Congress to pass this. What would you expect to happen in the inevitable constitutional challenge here?
Sure. So let's focus on two particular provisions, the Elections Clause, which even some of the most conservative justices on the court, at least in the past, have recognized that Congress has the power to address. And we're again talking about federal elections. And we're talking about also the Guarantee Clause, in which the court has said is non-justiciable. And here, what Congress is doing is that it is setting the times, places, and the manner, right, the process for conducting these various elections. And this is why I said, if Congress has any power to address issues of voting reform, it certainly has it in this particular context. And that's not too dissimilar, for example, in the 65 context, in which the court recognized that if Congress had any power, it certainly had it to address voting discrimination that everybody recognized was taking place across the country. And so I think this is a similar set here. Right now, would a conservative court look at this askance and decide that it is not going to do a good faith analysis of the constitutional questions? Well, there's nothing that I can say about that. But under a good faith analysis of the constitutional issues, there's no doubt that Congress has the power to implement The voting rate, I mean, as you said, this is a very comprehensive bill, and I'm here only concerned in this moment with the voting rights provisions. It certainly has the power to implement these voting rights provisions: automatic registration, same-day registration, prohibiting voter caging, right? All of these things that are dealing with federal elections. It clearly has the power to do so.
Dale, let me turn to you if you're able to turn on your camera.
Let's ask all of the panelists to go ahead and rejoin the room now and turn on their cameras if possible. Thank you.
I appreciated sort of the way you were describing what might be the most important, what might have the sort of biggest bang for the buck here. Can you maybe talk about this as a voting rights litigator a little bit? Like what would automatic registration or election day registration, I mean, talk about them in tandem, what would that do in terms of relieving the burden on voting rights litigators in the various kind of lawsuits that you have to bring each cycle?
Well, you see every cycle a lot of litigation over things like voter purges, right? Or other kinds of registration requirements. There was a lot of attention to a requirement in Georgia for an exact match between a person's voter registration information and information that they had on file with, say, the DMV. Well, if you automatically registered everyone at the DMV, you would eliminate the problem of that exact match, at least for people who are already in the DMV system. If you had election day registration, then to the extent that there were any errors in a person's file, that's something that presumably they might be able to correct at the polls on election day. And then, of course, we have litigation around purges, a case from Ohio that I worked on that went up to the Supreme Court. I was going to say 2, but I guess closer to 3 years ago at this point, where people would be purged from the rolls if they hadn't voted in a certain number of recent elections, based on a presumption that if you haven't voted, you must have moved and are no longer present in the jurisdiction, no longer a resident, no longer eligible to vote. And in every election, there would be thousands of people who had been purged under that practice would show up at the polls, indicate that they hadn't moved, and yet it would be too late because they'd been purged and they hadn't re-registered. Well, if you had election day registration, then you wouldn't need to, worry about that. And what I hope is that these kinds of reforms could potentially cut through some of the partisanization. I know that's a high hope, but around these issues, because if there are concerns about the accuracy of the rolls, right, and a need to, say, match databases, to make sure that whatever information in the voter files is, up to date and matches what information is available in other government databases. Well, automatic registration sort of takes that burden and puts it on the state and does it well in advance of the election instead of like in the run up to the election and the days beforehand when there might not be enough time to correct an error. Election day registration similarly allows people to show up at the polls and say, well, this is what my actual, accurate information looks like. And, there's no credible, suggestion that the 21 states that have election day registration have any more significant problems with election integrity than the states that require advanced registration. And those states are a mix of red states like, Colorado. I mean, sorry, I don't have my list, but states like Iowa and Idaho, Wyoming,
North Dakota, I think, right, has
North Dakota, right? Actually has no registration, I think, right? Oh no, sorry, no, I got that wrong. Okay, thanks, Mirna. But these are reforms that have existed for decades. They're in states across the ideological spectrum, and I think if voters had the experience of them, they'd see there wasn't anything to fear, and maybe they would appreciate that convenience.
Great. I don't want to drag us down like, well, what, the politics of this. We dealt with some of that yesterday, but I really want these sessions mainly to focus on like what the law does and what how they might change democracy. But Janae, since you mentioned the ex-felon reenfranchisement provisions, this might be one of those areas, given the kind of scramble we've seen on issues of criminal justice in the last decade, where maybe there is a bipartisan coalition that is forming on this. I'm not really keyed into the politics on what might be happening. Have you seen that, where you see Republicans who are willing to sign on to the felon reenfranchisement provisions?
Yes, I mean, I alluded to this in noting how the provision doesn't extend as far as including people who are currently incarcerated. And I think it is that compromise that brings people to the table across party lines to recognize that returning citizens should have an opportunity to participate in our democracy. We saw in states like Florida, where a supermajority of voters passed Amendment 4. Of course, we know it wasn't fully implemented appropriately, and that almost 900,000 returning citizens were unable to vote because they couldn't pay fines and fees, and the groups here were litigating that case up until the election to try to ensure that they could get the full benefit of Amendment 4, and hopefully there can be some political redress there. But we know that the will of the people is certainly expanding more and more toward the reenfranchisement of returning citizens. And I think a lot of that is a result of our mass incarceration and the likelihood that almost every American knows someone or knows someone who knows someone who's had some involvement in the criminal legal system, and recognizes that this lifelong punishment of people is not helpful to their return to society. It's not helpful in reducing recidivism. It's not helpful in integrating people back into our democracy. And so I do think that there is a political will. I'll add one other note. There have been many predictions about what returning citizens might do in terms of coloring the electorate in terms of favoring one party or another, but there really are mixed studies on what that actually might do. And so I hope that there is the political will to bring these folks back into the voting electorate.
Yeah, I agree with that last point about that. It's not clear the partisan valence of it's just as you compare states. Myrna, can you talk? We've got some questions in chat. And I want to turn it over to Dee Dee after this question to ask, recognizing, and I should say to our audience, both Guy Charles and Dale Ho have to leave because they've got to go teach, so they clearly have their priorities mixed up here. And my students should ignore that. But Myrna, we're getting a lot of questions in chat about the difference between the VRAA and the 2006 reauthorization of the Voting Rights Act. And so how is this bill constitutional and avoids the pitfalls that were highlighted in Shelby County?
I also want to be clear that I'm not taking a position on whether or not the pitfalls identified in Shelby County were actually appropriate pitfalls.
We will assume you disagree with Shelby
What I will
County.
say is that the VRAA is a response to that. The Shelby County wanted a modern assessment of on-the-ground problems, and the VRA does that through its coverage formula. There are two different parts of the coverage formula. One has to do with practices that have a historical and documented record of being exploited to the disadvantage of communities of color. And if a jurisdiction that meets certain population thresholds wants to undertake any of those practices, and they include things like changing their method of election, or changing the kind of eliminating the kind of language materials that they provide. If they want to make changes like that, then they need to be pretty sure that it's not going to make minority voters worse off before they go and start it. It also looks at it from a point of geography, and it examines which jurisdictions have violations of the 14th, the 15th Amendment, which jurisdictions have violations of the Voting Rights Act, which jurisdictions have violations of federal law, which jurisdictions have objections under the DOJ. And then it takes all of that and then determines how many do each of these jurisdictions have. And if you're a political subdivision and you have 3 or more in the past 25 years, you're subject to pre-clearance. If you are a state and you have 15 or more in the past 25 years, you're subject to pre-clearance. If you're a state and you have 10 or more, but one of those violations was a statewide practice, like statewide you did something, then you're subject to pre-clearance. So it is not overly relying on geography. It has a shorter time frame than the last coverage formula, and it's dynamic. It gets, so every year you're looking back 25 years, and so some will roll out, some will roll in, and it allows a very nimble response to the changes of today.
Great. Dee Dee, we've got 15 minutes and 26 questions. So
Okay.
See what you can do, and we'll see whether Janae and Myrna can knock a few of these out to satisfy.
We got it. If you
Well,
know,
we have a lot of categories of questions. I'll sidestep for now the many questions about whether or not, unless you have a quick answer, about whether or not Republican senators or members of Congress are going to support pieces of this legislation, or whether you think it has a chance of passage, just based on sort of the legislative tactics that your organizations are employing.
I think people are very optimistic about both. People are more optimistic about the Voting Rights Advancement Act, in part because this country, I think Americans believe that we are better off when there's not racial discrimination in the voting, and it's the politicians that are often doing things at our expense that is causing a lot of the problems. So I think there is a great deal of hope and optimism that we will be able to get a decent amount of bipartisan support. It has been historically been a bipartisan issue. And we're after an election, which is going to make things less political than right before an election. And certainly H.R.1, there's a great deal of public support, and there's a great deal of attention being created because of the active voter suppression. We just issued a report indicating that states all across the country are trying to thwart the political involvement of their voters. And I think voters are going to demand that the federal government steps in if the statewide politicians aren't realizing that they don't get to choose who votes for them. It's the voters who choose them.
Yeah, I'll just add that the disaffection of voters that came out of the last election should be alarming for all politicians. Many of the tactics that were intended to suppress the minority vote or to castigate minority voters as people engaging in fraud really backfired, particularly if we look at the Georgia election in terms of turnout. And so it really behooves both parties to try to encourage voters to come out, lest they, make many of their would-be voters opt out of the entire process, which, no matter what your particular inclination is politically, we should all have enough confidence in the positions that, we hold and the policies that we support to attract, a majority of the people to support them. That's what real competition is. I mean, we know that politics doesn't always work that way, but that's really what real competition requires, and bringing more voters into the process will do that. So I am hopeful in the same way that Myrna is, that we will get bipartisan support. We don't necessarily need full bipartisan support in the numbers that we had in the past for the Voting Rights Act in order to get it to pass. And I think that sort of aggressive it will take to make it happen.
Okay, great. I thought we had lost you for a second, but I'm glad you're back. So another set of questions has to do exactly with this relationship of the states and the federal government. Of course, H.R.1 applies to federal elections, creates a lot of uniform standards, a federal floor. But as Janae just mentioned, many states have been passing more active suppression efforts since the 2020 elections. How exactly does the bill work to either incentivize or authorize sort of states' compliance? Are there any opt-out procedures or loopholes written into the bill? How exactly will the federal government exercise authority over the states on all of these provisions?
Yeah,
I'm-
either we can.
Okay, sure. So I think people need to remember that HR1 is a massive, massive bill, and people are talking about it as if it's like one monolith thing, when actually it's a bunch of different policies. And so the question that I would ask is, with respect to X, what does it do? I'll take a very specific example of automatic voter registration. It sets, because a lot of states already have it, it says if you are meeting A, B, and C criteria with your automatic voter registration policy, then you be you, right? You don't have to change what you're doing. Very much like what the NVRA did when it came to election day registration and giving people opt-outs for purges. It says that if you have a voter identification requirement, fine, you get to keep it, but you need to define a written declaration of identity as one of the identifying factors that count. So it's not the part of the complexity of HR1 is that it is actually trying to get into the weeds of the different policies. And so if there is a feature where one is not appropriately responsive to the facts on the ground, then let somebody know and we'll try and get that fixed. It really does take each policy on its own and think about what does that look like in that state, and then either accounts for what the baseline sort of is, or says if you're doing better, continue with it.
Janae?
And I would say that, HR1 is quite surprising in its specificity with respect to what states must do. If we think about, even the early voting provision, I mean, it sets a specific number of days, 15 consecutive days of early voting, 10 hours per day. It must be accessible by public transportation in rural areas. There's a very clear message of accessibility and equity that HR1 is trying to provide. But again, I think it's so important to keep in mind that this is with respect to federal elections only. And in terms of what impact that will have on state elections, it will be costly. It will be an administrative nightmare to create two separate election systems, one for federal and one for state. So I think Guy put it very well in terms of the federal legislation creating a floor. And Mira just mentioned that in many instances, if states are doing better or they're doing more, have at it, that's fine. But at least this creates a floor for federal elections and will hopefully incentivize states to at least meet that floor. It requires them to meet that floor for federal elections, and hopefully that will bring their state elections into compliance, if not even greater access for voters.
Let me just put in 2 cents concurring with Janae there, which is that because we're getting these type of questions a lot, which is, all right, are we going to end up having 2 types of elections where we've got very restrictive state elections and then we have more regulated federal elections? As Janae mentioned, that would be extremely costly. I would expect some small jurisdictions to symbolically do something about that, but it's not. Our experience with things like literacy tests and the 65 Voting Rights Act, which had provisions that were then only applied to and poll taxes that were only applied to federal elections, is that the states don't set up parallel systems for local elections and state elections because they'd have to print separate ballots. They'd have to do all kinds of other things, and so this is a way of having constitutional authority under the Elections Clause, in addition to the Section 5 of the 14th Amendment, Section 2 of the 15th Amendment, but also to regulate the entire electoral system.
Okay, and the voters want it, right? I would just say, I'm sorry, Janae, but like the voters want this stuff, right? So it's really hard to say, we're actually going to spend extra money and extra trouble and extra hassle to be like resistant and keep up these 2 like clunky systems when the voters want access.
That's right. And I think that what this will help those litigators out there, like me and Marilyn and Dale, is when you see states make a concerted effort to veer from the federal standard, to carve out certain local elections. And if they do it in some jurisdictions and not others, that can be circumstantial evidence of targeted discrimination in some instances. So it'll be interesting. Hopefully this will pass and we will see how states and locales react and whether there is a targeted system to disenfranchise certain groups of voters in various jurisdictions.
Okay, our final two sets of questions. There's a set about voter fraud, which of course is a narrative that has emerged very recently and vocally after 2020. And a second set of questions about the pre-clearance provision, which Mirna, I know you've gone over in a little bit of detail, but let's talk about voter fraud first. People are a little bit worried, I suppose, that same-day registration, automatic registration, et cetera, might open up more avenues or possibilities for fraud. In what ways does this bill address potential concerns about fraud, and is it accompanied by any language that shores up faith in the election administration process? Janae.
Well, I can speak to the, just for example, the mail-in voting piece. And I think someone raised a question about signature verification and whether there have been problems with it. And certainly there have been, and it's been used in many ways to discriminate against voters of color. But H.R.1 does address that issue. And I think, you know, as I tried to point out in my remarks, that it tries to get out ahead of some of these allegations of voter fraud, even laying the foundation for biometrics, which, you know, is still rather controversial in terms of a verification method. But it lays out some specific ways in which states can use signature verification in ways that does not rely on what has historically been problematic data for signature verification, and it allows voters an opportunity, as I mentioned, to cure any mismatch that is not legitimate. So I think just through the various processes that H.R.1 lays out to protect due process rights of voters, it actually strikes a balance between guarding against potential fraud. And again, I must say that, you know, these allegations of fraud are very unfounded, but it's important that we recognize that the courts have held that, you know, states and federal governments can legislate for non-issues like voter fraud. But this, I think, strikes a pretty fair balance in providing voters an opportunity to still cast a ballot.
Can I say just one other thing? Because the issue of curing the problems with signature mismatches have come up. We have 2 reports at the Healthy Elections Project on signature issues, and the most important thing is to give voters an opportunity to cure. That is really the key way. You know, everyone, I think, agrees that the signature matching protocols are not an optimal system, right? We need a better, but that's what we've got. And so, but the most important thing is if for some reason there is a voter whose vote is not going to be able to be counted, that voter be able to cure that problem and be notified in a timely way, so that they, because almost all of the signature mismatch issues are like honest errors or just problems in the design of the envelopes or things like that. And so you want to make sure that people don't get inadvertently disenfranchised.
Mirna, any?
The thing that I would say is twofold. One, we need to not let politicians reject H.R.1 because of so-called concerns about fraud, when those politicians are the same one making people concerned about fraud. So like, I think that's one thing we need to do. 2, we also need to be mindful of the fact that confidence in our system is lost when people feel like they're shut out. Like we were staffing the phones on election day, and we were getting tons of calls from voters that were having problems. And when they feel like they cannot participate, that also is a confidence and an integrity issue. So having a system that includes all of us is going to restore confidence and faith in the system for at least some people. I would also note that there's funding in there, which is going to be helping for things like hardening against election security problems and public education and notice so that people understand it. So we need to be mindful of the fact that that the problems and the vulnerabilities of the system are also prevalent when people feel like it is closed and they don't get to participate.
Okay, on that note, I don't think we have time for more questions, but we do have a lot of resources that you can find on our website, drawing a lot from where these amazing litigators have been doing their work as well. So please continue to follow the discussion. Thank you so much, Janae, Mirna, Nate, and all of you for attending the session today. To learn more about voting rights, again, you can follow the conversations that are happening on social media and on our websites. and to get especially a deeper look into the provisions of HR1 in particular. We'll be back again next week. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.